They said he was wasting wood. The county insurance agent rode out to Silver Creek in January of 1886, looked at the sheet metal wrapped around the log walls, shook his head, and told the trapper flat, "You can't fight winter like that." 2 weeks later, the valley was cut off by snow. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and every cabin on the creek lost heat when the wind reversed the draft in their stovepipes. Every cabin except one. The problem wasn't the cold. It was the air moving inside the walls, stealing heat faster than any fire could replace it. The trapper at Silver Creek had figured that out the winter before, when he burned through his entire woodpile by February and still woke to frost on the inside of his door. He was a builder by training, stubborn by nature, and he understood that logs alone were never going to hold steady warmth when the wind came howling down from the passes. So he did something the valley had never seen. He sheathed his entire cabin in salvaged sheet metal, left a 4-inch gap between the metal and the logs, and packed that gap tight with sawdust from the mill down in the bend. Then, January showed up. The metal came from a failed stamp mill up near the headwaters. The owner had abandoned the site after a single season, leaving sheets of corrugated iron stacked under tarps. The trapper hauled them down on a sled, 3 trips over frozen ground, and started nailing them to the outside of his cabin in October. He worked alone most days, though a neighbor came by once to help lift the longer panels into place. The neighbor asked why he didn't just chink the logs tighter. The trapper said, "Chinking stops air, but it doesn't stop the cold that sinks into the wood itself." Metal and sawdust together, he said, would create a dead airspace that the wind couldn't touch. He started at the bottom and worked up, nailing the metal to vertical furring strips he'd already attached to the logs. Every panel overlapped the one below it, shingle style, so rain and snowmelt would run down and off. Once a section was up, he poured sawdust into the gap from the top, tamping it down with a long stick until it wouldn't settle any further. The sawdust was bone dry, pulled fresh from the mill's waste pile. Dry sawdust, he'd learned, holds almost no heat and stops air dead. Wet sawdust would rot the logs. Dry sawdust would last decades. By mid-November, the walls were done. He turned his attention to the roof. The original cabin had a simple pole and sod roof, adequate for summer, but a heat sieve in winter. He built a second roof inside the first, using split shakes nailed to new rafters, and filled the space between with more sawdust. The ceiling inside the cabin now sat 8 inches lower, but the temperature difference was immediate. On the first cold night after the roof work finished, he woke to silence. No wind howl, no creak of straining logs, no frost on the blanket, just the low crackle of coals in the stove. The skeptic arrived in early December. He was a man from the county office tasked with inspecting cabins for fire risk before winter locked the trails. He walked around the structure twice, tapped the metal with his knuckles, peered into the gap where one panel hadn't been sealed yet, and wrote something in a small ledger. Then he stood in the doorway and said, "This won't hold. You're trapping moisture in those walls, and the sawdust will pack down and leave gaps by spring. You'd be better off burning the wood." The trapper said nothing. He knew the sawdust wouldn't pack down if it stayed dry, and the metal would shed every drop of moisture that touched it. But he also knew the skeptic wouldn't believe him until the proof came. The proof came 6 weeks later. January brought the coldest stretch the valley had seen in years. The temperature dropped to minus 20, then minus 25, and stayed there for a week. Then the wind came. It started as a low moan in the passes and built to a steady roar by nightfall, driving snow horizontal across the flats, and piling drifts 6 feet high against the north walls of every cabin on the creek. The wind didn't just steal heat. It reversed the draft in the stovepipes, pushing smoke back down into the cabins and choking out the fires. One by one, the neighbors went dark. The trapper's stove stayed lit. He woke in the middle of the second night to the sound of wind hammering the metal panels, a rhythmic banging that rattled the whole structure. He got up, added 2 logs to the firebox, and checked the stovepipe. The draft was steady, the smoke pulling cleanly up and out. He opened the door and looked outside. The wind was strong enough to lean into, and the temperature had dropped further. He guessed, -30. He closed the door, latched it, and went back to his sleeping platform. The wool blanket was warm. There was no frost on the inside of the walls, no ice on the window glass, no visible breath indoors. The temperature inside held near 60 degrees with the stove damped down to a low burn. In the morning, he walked down to the nearest neighbor's cabin. The door was propped open, and smoke hung thick inside. The neighbor and his wife were standing outside in their coats, faces red from cold and coughing. They'd given up trying to keep the fire going after the backdraft filled the cabin for the 3rd time. The trapper offered them space on his floor until the wind quit. They looked at him, then at each other, and the neighbor asked how his stove was still drawing. The trapper said, "Metal and sawdust." 4 inches of dead air. The wind can't reach the logs, and the logs can't lose heat. The draft stays steady because the flue stays warm. They stayed 3 days. During that time, 4 more families from the creek knocked on the door and asked the same question. By the end of the week, the trapper had a line of visitors stretched down the trail, all of them wanting to see the inside of the cabin and understand how the metal and sawdust work. He explained it the same way each time. The sawdust stops the air from moving, and the metal stops the wind from touching the logs. Together they create a barrier that holds heat without adding weight or fire risk. The actual structure of the cabin hasn't changed. The innovation is the shell. One man asked about the cost. The trapper said the metal had cost him nothing but the labor of hauling it, and the sawdust was free from the mill. The furring strips were cut from deadfall. The nails were the only purchased item, and he'd used less than 10 pounds for the entire build. Total out of pocket, $2. The man looked at the walls, then at the stove, and said nothing. That silence said everything. The next visitor asked about moisture. The trapper walked him outside and showed him the overlap of the metal panels. Rain and snowmelt run down and off, he said. The sawdust never sees water. He tapped the metal near the base. No rot, no mold, no weakness. Just dry wood and dry insulation, locked in place by a skin that sheds weather. The skeptic returned in late January. He walked up to the cabin without knocking, stood in the yard, and stared at the chimney. Smoke rose straight and steady despite the wind. He walked to the door and opened it without waiting for an answer. The trapper was sitting at the table eating lunch. The skeptic stepped inside, closed the door, and stood silent for a long moment. Then he said, "How much wood have you burned this month?" The trapper gestured to a tally board on the wall. He'd been keeping account since November, every log split, every log burned, marked in chalk. The skeptic walked over and read the numbers. His face changed. The trapper had burned 85% less wood than the previous January, and the cabin had stayed warmer. The skeptic asked if the tally was accurate. The trapper said, "Every log." split 2 cords in November, and I still have more than half left. Last year, I burned 4 cords by February and froze anyway. The skeptic looked at the stove, then at the walls, then back at the tally board. He pulled a pencil from his coat and wrote something in his ledger. Then he said, "I'll be sending a crew to measure this in the spring. If your numbers hold, the county needs to know." The trapper said nothing. He went back to his lunch. The skeptic left, closing the door quietly behind him. February brought another storm. This one with heavier snow, but less wind. The trapper kept the fire low and steady. Twice a day he went outside to clear snow from the base of the walls, making sure no drift could block the ventilation gap he'd left at ground level. The metal panels were cold to the touch, but the logs behind them stayed dry and stable. Inside, the temperature never dropped below 55 degrees, even when the fire was banked overnight. That consistency was the real proof. Not the fuel savings, not the draft stability, but the simple fact that the cabin held its warmth without effort. He could sleep through the night without waking to add logs. He could leave for half a day and return to a warm room. The system worked because it required nothing but the initial build. Once the shell was in place, the cabin took care of itself. By mid-February, 3 other cabins on the creek had started similar builds. The trapper lent out his tools and walked each builder through the process, furring strips first, then metal, then sawdust tamped firm. He stressed the importance of keeping the sawdust dry and leaving a ventilation gap at the base. He also showed them how to seal the top edge where the metal met the roof, using strips of cloth soaked in pine tar and tacked down tight. That seal kept wind from blowing up into the gap and disturbing the sawdust. Without it, the system would fail. One of the new builders asked if the metal could be painted. The trapper said paint would work as long as it didn't seal the ventilation gap or trap moisture against the metal. He recommended leaving it bare for the first year to watch how it weathered, then painting in the spring if needed. The builder nodded and went back to nailing panels. That same week, a man from Down Valley rode up and offered to buy the salvaged metal. The trapper said it wasn't for sale, but directed him to the abandoned mill site where more sheets still sat under tarps. The man rode off and returned 3 days later with a sled loaded with metal. He stopped at the trapper's cabin to say the mill site was cleaned out now, and if anyone else wanted metal, they'd have to find another source. The trapper asked how much he'd taken. The man said, enough for 4 cabins, maybe 5. The trapper realized then that the idea had moved faster than he'd expected. March arrived warmer, but still well below freezing. The trapper began planning a second phase, insulating the floor. The cabin sat on short stone piers with open crawl space underneath, and cold air moved freely beneath the floorboards. He wanted to close that gap the same way he'd closed the walls, with metal and sawdust. He started by skirting the base of the cabin with vertical metal panels, leaving a single small access door on the south side. Then, he spread a layer of sawdust, 6 inches deep across the ground under the cabin, and tamped it flat. The result was a dead air pocket beneath the floor that cut the draft and stopped the ground cold from rising. The difference was immediate. His feet stayed warm when he stood in the center of the room. He also built a simple windbreak fence upwind of the cabin, using split poles and woven willow. The fence stood 5 feet high and ran the length of the north wall, set 10 feet out from the metal siding. Its purpose was to break the force of the wind before it hit the cabin, reducing the hammer effect that had rattled the panels during the January storm. The fence worked. The next time the wind came through, the cabin stayed quiet. The panels didn't bang, The structure didn't creak, and the draft in the stove stayed smooth. In early April, the skeptic returned with 2 men from the county office. They carried measuring tapes, notebooks, and a small metal probe for testing wall thickness. They spent an hour circling the cabin, recording measurements, and checking the condition of the metal and sawdust. One of them climbed onto the roof and used the probe to measure the depth of the attic insulation. He called down the number, 8 inches, packed firm, no settling. The skeptic wrote it down. Then they went inside and asked to see the tally board again. The trapper showed them the final count for the winter. 1.5 cords burned from November through March. The previous winter, same cabin, same stove, no metal or sawdust, 4 cords burned, and barely enough heat to prevent frost. The men looked at each other. One of them said, "That's not possible." The trapper said, "The wood is stacked outside. You can count it yourself." They counted the wood. The numbers matched. The skeptic closed his ledger and said, "I'll be writing a report. The county will want details on materials, costs, and labor hours. If this can be replicated, it changes how we build in the high country." The trapper said, "It's just metal and sawdust. Anyone can do it." The skeptic nodded, but his face said he understood it was more than that. It was the thinking that mattered, seeing the problem not as cold, but as moving air, and solving it with a barrier that didn't fight the wind, but simply ignored it. The men left. The trapper went back to work on the floor insulation, finishing the skirting and sealing the access door with a tight frame. By late April, 6 cabins on Silver Creek had metal siding and sawdust insulation. The trapper heard from a rider that 2 more were under construction further up the valley, and a homesteader near the county line had asked the mill for sawdust by the wagon load. The innovation had spread without promotion, carried by the simple fact that it worked and cost almost nothing. The trapper didn't consider it his invention. He considered it obvious, the kind of solution that should have been standard decades earlier. But the valley had built with logs alone for so long that no one questioned it until the fuel ran short and the cold became unbearable. That's the part people miss. The innovation wasn't the metal or the sawdust. It was the willingness to admit that the old way wasn't good enough, and the stubbornness to try something different, even when everyone said it was a waste. The following winter proved even colder than the first, with temperatures dropping to -35 degrees Fahrenheit in January. The trapper burned 1.25 cords of wood and never saw frost on the inside walls. His neighbors, those with the new metal and sawdust builds, reported similar results. The ones who hadn't upgraded burned through their wood piles by February and had to haul emergency loads from down valley at high cost. The county office included the metal siding method in their winter preparation guidelines that spring, listing it as a recommended upgrade for cabins above 4,000 feet. The skeptic's report noted the fuel savings, the draft stability, and the minimal cost. It also noted that the innovation required no specialized skills and could be completed by a single builder in less than 2 months. The report concluded, "This is the simplest and most effective cold weather adaptation we have documented in the high country. It should be standard practice." The trapper never advertised his work. He didn't need to. The cabin itself was the demonstration, visible to anyone who walked the creek trail. By the 3rd winter, metal-sided cabins were common enough that they no longer drew comment. They were simply part of the landscape, as ordinary as pole fences and stone foundations. That was the real success. Not fame, but adoption. The idea had moved from strange to standard in less than 3 years, carried by results that anyone could see and verify. The fuel savings alone justified the effort, but the comfort was what made it permanent. People who spent a winter in a metal-sided cabin didn't go back to logs alone. They understood what steady warmth felt like, and they wouldn't settle for less. The trapper lived in that cabin for another 15 years. He added improvements as time allowed. A larger stove, a second sleeping platform, a root cellar dug beneath the insulated floor. But the core structure never changed. The metal stayed intact. The sawdust stayed dry, and the heat stayed inside. He never calculated the total wood saved over those years, but others did. A neighbor who kept records estimated the trapper burned 60% less wood per winter than a comparable, uninsulated cabin. That difference, compounded over a decade and a half, represented hundreds of cords not cut, not hauled, not split, not burned. It represented time saved, labor saved, and forest left standing. It also represented a principle that the best innovations are the ones that disappear into daily use, so simple and effective that they stop being innovations and become just the way things are done. The county skeptic retired in the early 1890s. Before he left office, he wrote a final addendum to his original report on the Silver Creek cabin. The addendum noted that the innovation had spread beyond Montana territory, carried by trappers, miners, and homesteaders who'd seen it work and built their own versions in Wyoming, Idaho, and the Dakotas. He wrote, "The method is now common enough that it no longer requires documentation. It has become standard practice in regions where winter is the dominant challenge." That was the end of the official record. The rest is simply what happened. Cabins wrapped in metal and packed with sawdust, standing warm through winters that broke the ones built the old way. Smoke rising steady from chimneys while the wind howled outside. Families sleeping through the night without waking to add logs. Wood piles lasting twice as long. And a trapper at Silver Creek, stubborn and quiet, who proved that fighting winter isn't about force. It's about understanding what the cold actually does and building a wall it can't cross. The end. The method spread quietly, without fanfare or formal instruction. By the mid-1890s, metal-sided cabins had become standard in the high country, from the Bitterroots to the Absarokas. The technique moved through word of mouth, carried by packers and freighters who'd seen the Silver Creek cabin and understood what it meant. They didn't need blueprints or written guides. The logic was simple enough to grasp in a single conversation. Metal outside, air gap, sawdust fill, log wall inside. The materials were available at every settlement with a mill and a freight yard. The labor was straightforward enough for a single builder working alone. What made it spread wasn't complexity, but the opposite. It was so simple that anyone who understood the problem could execute the solution. The trapper at Silver Creek watched the changes ripple outward without feeling ownership. He'd solved his own problem, and the fact that others copied the solution didn't diminish it or expand it. It was just information, moving the way useful information always moves when it's not locked behind patents or proprietary claims. A writer would stop at the cabin, ask a few questions, walk the perimeter looking at the seams and overlaps, then ride on. A week later, another cabin would go up, with metal siding 30 miles away. That was the entire transfer process. No fees, no licensing, No formal training, just observation and replication. The simplicity of the method meant it could adapt to local conditions without losing effectiveness. In areas where sheet metal was scarce, builders used salvaged tin roofing or flattened cans. In regions with heavy snow load, they angled the metal panels to shed weight and prevent buckling. In wind-prone valleys, they added extra bracing and overlapped the seams more tightly. Each adaptation kept the core principle intact. Create a sealed barrier that stops air movement and prevents convective heat loss. The variations proved the method was robust, not fragile. It didn't require precision or expensive materials to work. It required only an understanding of what heat loss actually is, and a willingness to address it at the source. By 1896, the Territorial Land Office in Helena began requiring insulation specifications for new cabin permits above 5,000 feet elevation. The requirement wasn't prescriptive. It didn't mandate metal siding or sawdust fill. It simply stated that any structure intended for year-round occupancy must demonstrate a thermal resistance sufficient to prevent interior frost at -20 degrees Fahrenheit with a single stove fire. That standard effectively made insulation mandatory, and metal and sawdust was the cheapest way to meet it. The regulation formalized what had already become common practice, turning a grassroots innovation into official policy. The trapper never testified at the hearings or contributed to the drafting of the standard. His role was already complete. He'd built the proof, and the proof had done the rest. The fuel savings alone made the case. A settler burning 4 cords per winter versus 1.5 cords wasn't a marginal difference. It was the difference between subsistence and surplus, between spending half your waking hours on firewood or having time to trap, hunt, repair tools, and prepare for spring. That time savings compounded over years into a different quality of life. One where winter was a season to endure, but not a season that consumed all your energy and resources. The economic impact was clearest in remote districts where firewood had to be hauled long distances. A homesteader 20 miles from the nearest timber could spend a third of the winter cutting and hauling wood if the cabin wasn't insulated. With metal siding and sawdust fill, that same homesteader could cut the fuel load by 60% and spend the saved time on productive work. The difference showed up in spring planting schedules, in livestock survival rates, in the ability to maintain equipment and repair structures before the ground thawed. Insulation wasn't a luxury. It was a force multiplier that extended the effective working season and reduced the survival burden of winter. The trapper understood this not as theory, but as lived experience. He'd spent winters before the metal siding in a constant state of fuel anxiety, always calculating how many days the woodpile would last, always weighing the cost of another trip to the timber against the risk of running short. After the upgrade, that anxiety disappeared. The woodpile lasted twice as long, and he knew it would. That certainty changed how he approached winter. He could plan longer trap lines, commit to multi-day trips without worrying about the fire going cold, and focus on the work instead of the logistics. The mental shift was as valuable as the fuel savings. By the turn of the century, the innovation had reached the northern Rockies of Canada and the high plains of the Dakotas. Metis trappers along the Saskatchewan River built hybrid structures using buffalo hides over log frames, with sawdust packed between the hide and the wood. Homesteaders in eastern Montana used sod layered over metal panels, creating a double barrier that stopped wind and absorbed moisture. Miners in the Idaho Panhandle insulated their bunkhouses with shredded bark and sheet iron salvaged from played-out sluice operations. Each group adapted the method to their materials and conditions, but the principle remained the same. Stop the air, trap the heat, reduce the fuel load. The method also influenced commercial construction. Freight companies building way stations along winter routes began insulating their structures using metal and sawdust, reducing the fuel costs for their hostlers, and improving the survival rate of livestock held overnight in cold snaps. The Northern Pacific Railway experimented with insulated section houses for track crews, cutting heating costs and improving worker retention in remote districts. A mining company in Butte built insulated bunkhouses for its winter shift workers and reported a 20% reduction in sick days and a measurable increase in productivity. The innovation had moved beyond individual survival and into institutional adoption, proving its value at scale. The trapper heard these stories secondhand, through riders and freighters who stopped at Silver Creek and shared news from down the trail. He listened, asked a few questions, and went back to his work. The spread of the method didn't inflate his sense of accomplishment. He'd solved a local problem, and the solution had turned out to be general. That was useful, but it didn't change his daily life or his understanding of what he'd done. He'd built a warm cabin in a cold place using cheap materials and common sense. The fact that others did the same didn't make it historic. It made it practical. The winters continued, as they always had. The cold came down from the north in November, settled into the high valleys, and stayed until April. The wind blew, the snow piled up, and the nights dropped to -30 or worse. But inside the metal-sided cabins, the stoves burned steady, the walls stayed dry, and the people slept warm. That was the only legacy that mattered. Not recognition, not credit, but the simple fact that winter had become survivable without heroic effort or constant struggle. The innovation had turned an existential threat into a manageable inconvenience. And that shift, repeated across thousands of cabins and decades of winters, was the real proof of value. The trapper lived at Silver Creek until 1908, when age and a bad fall during spring trapping made it clear he couldn't manage the isolation anymore. He sold the cabin to a young family from the valley, showed them how to maintain the metal seams and check the sawdust for settling, and moved to a small room above the general store in town. The cabin stood for another 40 years, inhabited by a series of families and solitary trappers who all benefited from the work he'd done. The metal siding never failed. The sawdust never rotted. The structure stayed warm through winters that broke poorly built cabins up and down the creek. By the time the cabin was finally abandoned in the late 1940s, the method it demonstrated had been standard practice for half a century, so deeply embedded in regional building culture that no one remembered it had ever been controversial or experimental. It was just how you built in cold country. That forgetting was the final proof of success. The innovation had become invisible, absorbed into the ordinary knowledge of how to survive winter in the mountains. The trapper's name didn't appear in any records or histories. The cabin wasn't marked or preserved, but every insulated structure built in the northern Rockies after 1885 carried the logic he'd proven, that cold isn't a force to fight with fire alone, but a problem to solve with barriers, dead air, and an understanding of how heat actually moves. That knowledge, passed from builder to builder and embedded in 10,000 cabins across the high country, was the inheritance he left. It wasn't grand, but it was real, and it kept people warm. The cabin at Silver Creek stood empty for the first time in nearly 70 years in the spring of 1949. The last occupant, a widow who'd lived there through the war years, moved to Missoula to be near her daughter. The structure remained sound, metal siding intact, roof tight, no rot in the logs, no frost damage to the foundation. The sawdust in the walls had settled slightly over the decades, but still provided effective insulation. A Forest Service ranger inspecting the property that summer noted in his report that the cabin was in better condition than structures built 30 years later, and attributed the durability to the metal cladding and the absence of moisture penetration. The report recommended the cabin be maintained as a potential emergency shelter, but budget constraints and the remote location meant no action was taken. The structure simply stood, weathering seasons without human presence, holding its warmth potential in reserve. By the 1950s, the method the trapper had pioneered was so common, it no longer warranted mention in building guides or homesteading manuals. Insulation was assumed. Metal siding over log frames was standard in high-altitude construction. The specific combination of sheet metal, air gap, and sawdust fill had evolved into more refined systems using commercial insulation materials. But the underlying principle remained unchanged. Create a sealed thermal barrier that stops convective heat loss and reduces fuel demand. The innovation had been absorbed into the baseline of competent cold climate construction, indistinguishable from a dozen other techniques that had similarly transitioned from experimental to ordinary over the span of a human lifetime. The economic impact of that transition was measurable, but dispersed. Thousands of households across the northern Rockies burned less wood, spent less time on fuel procurement, and experienced fewer health complications from cold exposure. Those gains didn't appear in aggregate statistics or economic reports because they were distributed across individuals and decades, but they were real. A family burning 2 cords per winter instead of 5 had resources available for other needs: better food, warmer clothing, tools, livestock, savings. That margin, repeated across generations, represented a quiet improvement in material conditions that never announced itself, but accumulated steadily. The innovation didn't create wealth, but it stopped wealth from being consumed by the simple act of staying warm. The trapper who'd built the original cabin lived until 1912, dying quietly in the room above the general store where he'd spent his final years. He left no written records, no detailed plans, no formal account of the innovation or its spread. His estate consisted of a few tools, some worn clothing, and a small savings account that covered his burial. The obituary in the county paper noted his years as a trapper and his reputation as a skilled builder, but made no mention of the insulated cabin at Silver Creek or the method that had spread from it. The omission wasn't an oversight. By 1912, the innovation was so embedded in local practice that connecting it to a single individual would have seemed arbitrary. Dozens of builders had used the same technique, adapted it, improved it, and passed it on. The trapper's role as the originator had dissolved into the collective knowledge of the community. That dissolution was typical of practical innovations in isolated regions. Without formal patent systems, marketing channels, or institutional documentation, useful techniques spread through observation and replication, losing their origin stories in the process. The information became common property, not through legal declaration, but through use. Anyone could see the method, understand it, and apply it. The lack of ownership barriers meant rapid adoption, but also meant no individual or institution could claim credit or extract rents. The innovation belonged to everyone because it belonged to no one, and that absence of proprietary control was precisely what allowed it to spread so quickly and adapt so flexibly to local conditions. The Silver Creek cabin stood through the 1950s and into the early 60s, gradually deteriorating as weather and neglect took their toll. The metal siding held up better than the logs beneath it, protecting the structure from moisture, but unable to prevent the slow settling and shifting that comes with decades of freeze-thaw cycles. By 1965, the roof had developed leaks. The door frame had warped, and small animals had begun nesting in the attic space. A pair of hikers sheltering from a storm that summer reported the interior still felt noticeably warmer than outside, even with the door hanging open and gaps in the roof. The insulation, after 80 years, still functioned. The structure finally collapsed in the winter of 1973, brought down not by cold or wind, but by the accumulated weight of snow on a roof that had lost its structural integrity. The metal siding, still intact, folded inward as the log frame gave way, and the entire cabin settled into a compact heap that was gradually covered by drifts and then by vegetation as the years passed. By the 1980s, only a slight rise in the ground and a few fragments of rusted metal marked the site. The innovation itself, however, continued in thousands of structures across the region, its logic preserved not in monuments or records, but in the walls of buildings that still kept people warm. The principle the trapper demonstrated, that cold is best defeated not by burning more fuel, but by preventing heat loss, became the foundation of all subsequent advances in thermal efficiency. Modern insulation materials, vapor barriers, and building codes all trace back to the same insight. Heat moves through convection, conduction, and radiation, and the most effective intervention is to block those pathways rather than simply generate more heat. The trapper didn't articulate that principle in scientific terms, but he understood it operationally and proved it worked. Every building constructed since then, with insulation in its walls, carries that proof forward, whether the builders know the history or not. The story of the Silver Creek cabin isn't a story of genius or heroism. It's a story of practical problem solving, applied to a survival challenge, tested under real conditions, and refined until it worked reliably. The trapper wasn't trying to change the world. He was trying to stay warm without exhausting himself cutting firewood. And he succeeded by thinking clearly about the problem and building a solution that addressed the actual physics of heat loss. The fact that his solution was copied widely doesn't make him a visionary. It makes him competent. And it makes the problem he solved universal enough that his solution had broad applicability. The lesson isn't about individual brilliance. It's about the value of understanding the problem you're trying to solve, testing your solutions honestly, and sharing what works without trying to own it. The end. The method survived because it was simple enough to replicate without specialized tools or materials, but effective enough to produce measurable results that justified the effort. That balance between accessibility and performance was rare in frontier technology, where most improvements required either expensive inputs or complex techniques that couldn't be easily transferred. The metal-sided cabin required only materials available in any logging or mining district, skills within reach of a competent builder, and no ongoing maintenance beyond what any structure needed. The barrier to adoption was low, and the return on effort was immediate and tangible. That combination ensured the method would persist as long as the conditions that made it necessary persisted. The conditions did persist. Winter in the northern Rockies didn't moderate. The cold remained deep, the wind remained constant, and the fuel demands of poorly built structures remained punishing. The climate itself selected for better building methods, and the metal-sided cabin with its sawdust insulation represented a stable solution that met the selection pressure without requiring inputs that couldn't be sustained locally. It was an equilibrium strategy, not an optimal one, But equilibrium strategies are what survive in the long term, because they balance cost and benefit in a way that doesn't exhaust the system supporting them. By the mid-20th century, commercial insulation materials began to replace sawdust and other organic fills. But the logic of the metal-sided cabin carried forward. Fiberglass bats, foam boards, and reflective barriers all operated on the same principle. Create a dead air space that interrupts heat flow, and seal it behind a barrier that stops wind penetration. The materials changed, but the architecture of the solution remained the same. The trapper's cabin at Silver Creek was an early expression of a thermal strategy that became universal, and the fact that it was forgotten as a specific innovation only confirmed how completely it had been integrated into standard practice. The historical invisibility of practical innovations is a recurring pattern. The techniques that change daily life most profoundly are often the ones that leave no monuments, no named inventors, and no clear origin points, because they emerge from shared problem-solving in distributed communities and spread through imitation rather than formal dissemination. The moldboard plow, the box stove, the log skidder, the hay rake, the root cellar, the spring house, all followed the same trajectory. Someone built a better solution, others copied it. The method spread, and the originator's name dissolved into anonymity. The metal-sided cabin fits that pattern exactly. It worked. It spread. It became ordinary. And its history vanished because its function was preserved. The question of credit, in that context, becomes irrelevant. The trapper at Silver Creek didn't need recognition, because recognition wouldn't have improved his life or validated his work. The work validated itself every winter when the stove held steady and the walls stayed warm. The people who copied the method didn't owe him anything, because he hadn't taken anything from them by solving the problem first. Knowledge, once demonstrated, costs nothing to replicate and loses nothing in replication. The trapper benefited from staying warm. Everyone who copied the method benefited the same way. That symmetry of benefit is the marker of a genuinely useful innovation, one that creates value without extracting rents. The economic logic of that symmetry shaped the development of frontier technology more broadly. In the absence of patent enforcement, capital investment, or institutional gatekeeping, innovations succeeded or failed based purely on whether they solved real problems more effectively than existing methods. The test was empirical and immediate. If a new cabin design kept you warmer with less wood, you built that design. If it didn't, you didn't. There was no marketing, no branding, no artificial scarcity. The method competed on performance alone, and the best methods won by being copied until they became the default. That selection environment produced robust, practical solutions because it filtered out everything that didn't work under real conditions. The metal-sided cabin worked under real conditions for nearly a century. That longevity is the measure of its value. It wasn't replaced because something better came along that was just as accessible. It was replaced because commercial materials became cheap enough and available enough to offer similar performance with less labor. The transition from sawdust to fiberglass wasn't a rejection of the original method. It was an efficiency upgrade within the same framework. The core insight that stopping air movement and creating dead space reduces heat loss more effectively than burning more fuel remained intact and continues to underpin every modern building code in cold climates. The trapper's contribution, then, wasn't the specific materials or the exact construction sequence. It was the demonstration that the principle worked and could be implemented with local resources by people without specialized training. That demonstration lowered the perceived risk of trying the method and provided a reference point that made replication easier. Other builders didn't need to invent the method from scratch. They could look at the Silver Creek cabin, see that it worked, and adapt it to their own circumstances. The trapper absorbed the experimental risk, and everyone else benefited from the proof. That's the pattern of useful innovation in decentralized systems. Early adopters bear the cost of uncertainty, and later, adopters benefit from demonstrated success. The social dynamics of that pattern are worth noting. The trapper didn't hoard the method or attempt to monetize it. He built it for himself, and when others asked about it, he explained how it worked. That openness wasn't altruism. It was practical self-interest in a community where mutual aid and shared knowledge increased everyone's survival odds. Helping a neighbor build a better cabin meant that neighbor was less likely to freeze, more likely to stay productive, and more likely to be available to help when you needed it. The reciprocity wasn't transactional or immediate, but it was real, and it created an incentive structure that favored the free sharing of useful techniques. The trapper's willingness to explain the method reflected that structure, and the rapid spread of the method confirmed its effectiveness. The pattern holds lessons for how technical knowledge spreads and persists. Formal systems, patents, proprietary methods, create artificial bottlenecks that slow adoption and limit adaptation. Informal systems, observation, replication, local modification, allow rapid diffusion and continuous improvement. The metal-sided cabin spread faster and adapted more flexibly than it could have under any formal innovation regime, because there were no barriers to copying and no constraints on modification. Every builder who used the method also refined it, adjusting details to fit local materials, climate variations, and personal preferences. That collective refinement produced a more robust solution than any single inventor could have designed alone. The trapper at Silver Creek initiated that process, but he didn't control it, and the method's success didn't depend on his continued involvement. Once demonstrated, the innovation became common property, and its development became a collective effort distributed across hundreds of builders over decades. That distribution of development effort is what allowed the method to persist and evolve as conditions changed. No single point of failure, no dependency on a specific individual or institution, just a shared understanding that could be passed from person to person as long as the need remained. The need did remain, and the understanding persisted. By the late 20th century, the specific construction details of the Silver Creek cabin had been forgotten, but the principle it demonstrated was taught in every building trades program and encoded in every energy code. Stop the air, trap the heat, reduce the fuel load. The words changed, the materials changed, but the logic stayed the same. The trapper's cabin was one early expression of that logic, and its historical obscurity is less a loss than a confirmation that the knowledge it embodied had been fully absorbed into the common practice of building in cold climates. The innovation succeeded so completely that it disappeared into the baseline of competence, and that disappearance is the highest form of validation a practical technique can achieve. The end.